The rain poured across the tarmac and into the open doorway of the barracks as Cadet Rena stepped out of the waiting transport, her boots hitting slick concrete and leaving dark smears that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead, hesitated at the threshold for a heartbeat, and then entered the hall where every echo felt louder than it ought to be. The air smelled of damp gear, of cellulose, and of nervous energy that seemed to pulse through every pane of glass and every folding. Dr. Shi had arrived just as the storm deepened, just as the wind shook the gutters outside, and the old building groaned like something alive and unsettled. Inside the corridor, the rows of lockers stood silent, tombs of belongings already claimed. By others, thick straps of duffel bags hung from hooks, names stitched onto patches that told stories she did not yet share. The floor here was pristine but softened by the endless footsteps of new recruits. So many boots, so much movement, so many hopes and fears all mingled into a haze of sterile steel and institutional expectation. She walked slowly as if she were stepping into a painting someone else had begun, and she was invited to take her place but not yet allowed to touch the canvas. At the far end of the hallway, she could hear laughter high-pitched and hollow like wind rattling a loose window pane. Around the corner, a group of cadets clustered near the shower block, the door yawning like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. She paused for a second to adjust the strap of her rucksack across her shoulder to clear her breath, as though the building expected submission and not hesitation. She had not cared for the drill when she came in. But now the quiet made the drillers, voices small, distant and cold, as if the whole place had been built on resolve rather than comfort. She did not catch the name of the cadet who came out of the shower corridor first. His head was bare and water trickled down his neck. He scowled at her with a look more habitual than directed and returned with a joke she did not hear, but felt in the shiver of pretense around her. He did not know her name, but she knew his, and the others who followed in quick succession were predictable. Shapes in predictable lines, their training uniforms still damp, their eyes glinting in the artificial light like stones entering water too fast. They watched her as she passed the showers, each step measured, but her heartbeat quickened with awareness. She spotted the smirks, the sideways glances, the barely suppressed laughter, and an ache rose in her chest. The kind of ache that lived beneath the ribs and whispered poorly disguised threats. She felt the weight of their gaze as though she carried, in her boots, the burden of their doubt and the echo of their mocking words. She took her own corner of the locker room, as if staking territory in a wild land where the map was unfamiliar and the signage indecipherable. No one spoke to her. She didn't approach the group. She didn't ask for their names or crack jokes to display. She belonged. She simply placed her bag beside the metal bench and unclipped the hook of her wet coat, letting it fall onto the floor in a puddle of authority. She refused to claim, but which felt truer than the uniform on her back. She washed her hands in the sink nearby the sound of water, a sharp slash in the quiet, and she looked at herself in the mirror. The reflection uncanny with damp hair plastered to her skull, and eyes wide with unspoken calculations. She thought of the telegram she had received before muster, the brief words telling her assignment to rendezvous with the base she had not chosen. She thought of the long drive here through storm-swept roads, of no man's land where the trees leaned like watchers and the sky had been an oppressive dome of steel. She had felt small then, but determined, and the thought of surrendering now to the unknown mockery felt wrong to her, even though the moment felt heavier than any march she had endured. She lifted a finger to her temple as though pressing an invisible button that said "Stand by," and the world around her seemed to hum in match. A voice rang out sudden sharp from the corridor announcing, "Lights out and assembly in the drill yard 5 minutes." She did not flinch. She simply turned from the mirror and walked toward the group nearby for a better vantage point. She stood behind them exactly 2 steps and didn't bother to clear her throat or nod, as though she had already accepted the stance of outsider. She felt the steam dripping from the open shower door like a curtain trying to hide something bigger than itself. The path ahead was soaked, and the benches still damp, and the smell of shampoo mingled with disinfectant. Her gaze roamed across faces, the young ones, the hardened ones, the ones already losing the shine of hope, and the ones gaining something else entirely, a hardness, a readiness. She wondered which category she belonged to, but would not decide just yet. The lead cadet, Hartman, swaggered forward 2 paces, taking a position at the front of the group. He glanced at her once, not enough to hide contempt. The others followed his lead, making jokes and clutching towels, and some of them nudged each other quietly, glancing her way. She ignored them. She focused instead on the door that led to the courtyard where they would muster, and the rain still tattooing the windows in a rhythm that felt like countdown. She waited until they filed out, then slipped into the shadows of the corridor behind them, her boots echoing softly like secrets shared between walls. She paused at the exit of the shower block and watched the group out in the yard, their silhouettes, gray and blurred by the foam of rain. She kept her face calm, composed, unyielding. She had learned long ago the value of silence, the power in stillness, the way the world underestimates a person who says nothing. She tightened the strap of her rucksack. She felt its weight, not like a burden, but as something anchored. Perhaps the weight would reveal itself later. She unlocked the clasp with a fingernail, and a small, sleek device slipped out. She tucked it back before anyone noticed and turned to join the formation, stepping in line exactly behind Hartman at his left shoulder, 2 steps more and 1 to the right, so she wasn't directly in his shadow, but close enough to observe him. She heard the instructor's voice like static, and then the whistle blew and commands issued themselves into the damp air. They marched across the yard, the rain cooling their faces, the lights overhead flickering and casting ghost shapes at their feet. They moved in a pattern she didn't know yet, but she followed without hesitation. The world seemed to shrink around her to the single focus of feet heels hitting ground, shoulders squared and breath controlled. She could feel the eyes of Hartman drifting to her now and then, and each time she held the gaze a fraction longer than expected, then dropped hers to the puddle at her boots. She sensed the doubt in the shift of his stance, the tightening of his jaw, and she felt something faint in her chest, like the first spark of challenge. The drive to prove herself began deeper than the physical drills, the mud runs, the obstacle courses at dawn. She carried a ledger in her mind, tallying every sneer, every doubtful pause, every mocking glance. She did not keep score to hurt them, but to use the energy. Those looks became fuel. The coldness in Hartman's voice when he barked an order became wind, pushing her forward. She remembered the word silent from the briefing she had received before arrival. Stand, observe, act, only speak when spoken to. She realized now the training was not just muscle and endurance, but patience and presence. And as the day closed, the rain ceased abruptly, and a pale light crawled through narrow slits in the clouds. She returned to the barracks shower, area her uniform still damp, her resolve still fierce. She encountered the group again at the benches, and the jokes rose once more. But this time she did not flinch. She met Hartman's eyes and held them until he looked away. The smirk faltered, and the laughter fell short of sound. She took her place under the shower and let the warm water wash away the grit of the day and not the pain of the words. Not yet. She thought of tomorrow. The test that waited in the woods. The instructors had warned. Of terrain. Unknown. Radio silence, no margin. She did not feel fear. She felt ready. She felt something sharper. When she stepped out, the group had dispersed to their bunks. The dormitory lights were low, the uniform lockers locked, the atmosphere heavy, With anticipation, she laid out her gear, precisely adjusting slippers in line the helmet, the gloves, the combat boots, all arranged as though to say, "I belong." She didn't lock eyes with anyone. She didn't reach for friendship. She simply exhaled and sat on the edge of her bunk, looking at the cracked ceiling as if it held secrets. She felt the mattress subtly sag under her weight and considered that she might be sinking, but only for a moment before she lifted herself up again. The window rattled in its frame, the final gust of storm still claiming its rights. Tomorrow she would step into that unknown forest, and the mocked cadet would lead with silence her shield and resilience her unspoken weapon, and she would watch them recalibrate their assumptions. And when they did, she would act not with noise, but with quiet precision, awaiting the moment when the world shifted, because she didn't just stand in the corner of the showers. She stood at the threshold of revelation. The morning began with the kind of sky that warned more than it promised. The clouds hung low like watching eyes, and the sun stayed hidden, as though it too refused to bear witness to what was about to unfold. The cadets were lined up in the drill yard, their faces pale, their uniforms soaked from the mist that crept like fingers over the ground, and in the center of the formation stood Rena, still silent, still unreadable, her eyes scanning the line for Hartman, who paced like a predator, waiting to strike again. They had spent the night tossing through sleep, interrupted by alarms and phantom knocks on the steel doors of the barracks, the kind of rest that never truly arrived and left them more exhausted than any 5-mile run. Rena had risen before the call without hesitation, her boots already laced, her bag packed perfectly, as if she had been waiting for this specific chaos. The drill sergeant appeared out of the fog, like a figure drawn in charcoal-sharp lines, hard edges. No warmth in the eyes, he barked out orders. But this time they were different. This was no normal exercise, no routine drill. He motioned toward the trucks lined up at the edge of the compound, engines humming and bodies already loaded with gear. The sergeant spoke of navigation, of silence, of survival, and he mentioned the forest by name as if it were a living, breathing thing with its own memory and malice. No maps, no compasses, no radios, only coordinates scrawled on a single strip of laminated paper given to the lead cadet of each group. Hartman snatched his without a glance and immediately began shouting assignments, ignoring Rena, entirely dividing up the squad into pairs that made no strategic sense, but fed his ego. Rena said nothing. As expected, she remained the shadow, the unacknowledged variable, as they loaded into the back of the open truck. Rena noticed Alvarez sitting near the tailgate, his expression calm but curious. He had been watching her for days, not with judgment, but something closer to calculation, and he shifted slightly as she sat beside him, his eyes asking questions, his mouth staying closed the way people do when they're unsure if what they're seeing is real or just out of place. The ride to the drop point was quiet, except for the low static of the radio in the front cab and the occasional nervous cough from the cadets huddled close together as the trees began to close in around them, the sky turning darker. Though it was not yet noon, the forest welcomed no one and offered no paths, only roots that seemed to reach up from the ground like fingers trying to pull them down. Once deployed, the team fanned out as ordered, but the plan dissolved almost instantly. Hartman pushed forward with two, others ignoring terrain, ignoring logic, moving too fast, too loud, as if trying to outrun his own lack of preparation. Within minutes, he vanished behind a ridge, followed by one shout, and then silence. Not even the birds responded. Rena paused, then checked. The angle of the sun through the canopy, it was barely visible, but enough to tell her Hartman had gone the wrong way. Alvarez stood beside her, now breathing hard from the climb, eyes flicking back toward where the others had hesitated, waiting for instruction that would not come. "We need to regroup," he muttered. She turned to him slowly, her expression unreadable, but her posture already in motion. She walked in the opposite direction from the others, every step purposeful, every glance precise. Alvarez followed her without another word. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more it seemed to watch them, the trees thicker, the shadows longer, the air heavier, like they were walking into something ancient and hidden. Rhina pulled something from her pocket, then concealed it quickly. A device no standard cadet should possess, but Alvarez had seen it clearly, and now his silence was heavy with questions. They stopped at the edge of a clearing where the wind refused to cross, and Rhina turned, slowly scanning the area before finally speaking, her voice low but certain mission active. She said, and those two words cracked the silence like thunder. Alvarez froze. "What mission? What the hell are you talking about?" he whispered. But Rhina had already dropped to one knee and pulled out the device again, sinking it to something he could not see. Her fingers moved with practiced speed, and her face betrayed no emotion. She wasn't one of them. Not really. Not just another cadet struggling to earn stripes. She was something else, something embedded, something trained beyond the drills and the muscle and the sweat. She had been sent here not to pass or fail, but to observe and test. And now that the real exercise had begun, she was no longer bound. By silence, in the distance a flare lit the sky, faint but deliberate. Alvarez turned his head toward it, but Rhina remained still, watching the screen in her hand that now displayed lines of code and a blinking marker. Then she looked up and said, "They're not lost. They're not missing. They're being watched," Alvarez asked. "Watched by who?" But she didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she stood and walked toward the sound of a rustling branch and stopped just short of a small rise in the terrain above. Them? A figure moved, barely visible, then gone too fast for a regular cadet, too quiet for an animal. "This is part of the test," she said, and this time her voice carried weight, not just volume. Alvarez followed her again, and now he carried the fear that maybe he was part of something he hadn't agreed to. Maybe they all were. Maybe the entire squad had been fed into a machine designed to measure fear, strategy, leadership, or lack of it. They climbed the hill and found a clearing with marks in the soil, boot prints too clean, too deliberate. They were being herded. Someone was directing their movement, someone outside the chain of command or above it. Alvarez asked her who she really was. She looked at him, then tilted her head slightly like she was weighing the risk of telling him more. "You'll know soon," she said. And then she touched the earpiece hidden under her collar and whispered a code that Alvarez could barely hear, but it made the device in her hand pulse once and then turn green somewhere. In the distance, a helicopter blade began to cut the air. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper, the light fading not with time, but with the weight of something pressing from above, something unseen. Yet fully felt, the air changed around them, carrying a silence that was unnatural. Not quiet, but suffocating, as if sound itself had been swallowed. Alvarez kept glancing behind them, not because he heard anything, but because he could not trust that nothing was there. Rhina, on the other hand, moved with precision, her feet never stumbling, her breath steady, her eyes scanning not just for danger, but for meaning. They reached a slope slick with moss and wet roots, twisting like veins across the ground, and Rhina stopped, suddenly lifting one hand to signal silence, even though no one was speaking. Alvarez froze beside her, watching her eyes narrow toward a shadow between two trees. It shifted, then vanished, not like an animal, not like something alive, but like something trained like them, or worse. "We are not alone," she whispered, and this time her voice was filled with certainty, not fear. She stepped forward, slowly crouching as she reached into the foliage and pulled out a broken comm link half buried in the mud. The unit was fried. Wires exposed, the casing melted. It had not died naturally. It had been taken out deliberately. Alvarez felt his pulse quicken now, understanding what she meant when she said test. This was not about terrain or endurance. It was about exposure, about Pressure about truth and falsehood and the layers between them, and maybe even about who would break first. Ahead they found signs, more of them, pieces of gear scattered along the path. Things no soldier would drop unless forced to canteens, tags even. A rifle snapped clean across the barrel. Rena bent down, examining the markings. Not military, not issued. This damage was personal surgical. "We need higher ground," she said, and began to climb toward a ridge that overlooked the basin where they had last. Seen movement, but even as they reached the crest and stared out into the endless expanse of trees, she could tell something was wrong. The forest was too still. No wind, no birds, no movement at all. Alvarez stepped beside her, his face pale now. He had stopped asking questions. He simply followed because he knew now that whatever game they thought they were playing, it was no longer under their control. From the ridge they saw a trail leading east. The dirt packed down the leaves disturbed it had. Been used recently, and not just by cadets. It led toward a ravine where the trees broke apart and the ground dipped sharply. Rena moved again without speaking. Every step closer to the edge made Alvarez more tense. He was starting to understand she was not tracking the missing cadets. She was tracking something else entirely, something that was tracking them back. They reached the ravine just as the last of the light died, and then a sound echoed sharp and distant. Not a voice, not an animal, a mechanical click, followed by silence and then movement fast and deliberate. Something descending the far slope but not falling, not slipping. It moved with direction. Rena grabbed Alvarez by the sleeve and pulled him down behind a cluster of boulders, just as the figure appeared across the gap. It wore standard gear, but the posture was wrong, the stance too calm, too prepared. This was no cadet, and Rena knew it immediately. She tapped her device twice, and a screen lit up in green, confirming something she had suspected, but hoped to avoid. Target confirmed. Alvarez looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "What target? What is this?" And Rena turned to him, her expression unreadable but serious. "I was sent to monitor the program," she said, "not the training. The leadership, the systems, and the cracks within them. But now, I believe, there is a breach. Someone has taken control of the exercise and turned it into a hunt." Alvarez stared at her, then back at the figure who had vanished again, slipping into the brush without a trace, his breath caught in his throat. "Are they even still alive?" he asked, and the question hung between them heavier than any silence they had shared. Rena stood slowly, scanning the tree line again. "We need to reach the fallback point. There is an extraction team en route, but they won't land unless I confirm visual, and we don't have long. If the breach reaches the perimeter, this becomes more than a test, it becomes exposure." Alvarez followed her again, and this time with more purpose, more resolve, because now he understood this was bigger than Hartman, bigger than mocking and showers and whispered doubts. This was about something hidden, something embedded, something dangerous. They moved fast now, climbing across broken terrain and ducking under branches that clawed at their uniforms. Every sound behind them felt louder. Every crack of a twig, every sudden gust of wind, a possible warning. And as they reached the plateau above, the ravine, Rena froze again, her hand gripping Alvarez's arm as she pointed ahead. Three shapes moved through the trees, dragging something between them. It was hard to see through the mist, but Alvarez recognized the limp form of one of their own Daniels. His uniform torn, his face slack, his gear missing. The three figures were not cadets. They moved like ghosts, too fast, too sure. "Too clean. We need to split," she said. "You draw them toward the creek bed. I will move around and intercept if I don't make contact in 20 minutes, continue to fallback point, and initiate the second phase." "What second phase?" Alvarez asked. But she was already gone, moving through the trees with practiced efficiency, her body melting into shadow, her presence vanishing. Like vapor, he hesitated, then ran the opposite direction, crashing through the undergrowth, hoping to make enough noise to be noticed without being caught, hoping Rena knew exactly what she was doing. Behind him, something moved, something too close, something that had not been there a second ago. And ahead the fallback point waited if they could reach it before everything unraveled. The air at the fallback point was thinner, colder, sharper than the forest below, and it cut into Alvarez's lungs with every breath he took as he climbed the final slope, the weight of fear settling in like frost on his shoulders. He paused behind a fallen tree, bark stripped bare, and waited, trying to listen over the rush of his heartbeat for any sign of movement behind him. But the woods had gone deathly quiet again. No footsteps, no voices, not even wind, the way it always did right before something happened. He had followed her instructions, exactly moved away from the figures dragging Daniels into the mist had led them off the trail across a gully deeper into the terrain where his footfalls grew louder and his chances of survival smaller still. No one pursued him, at least not that he could see, and that alone made him nervous, because in a place like this, silence was not peace. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. He crouched and pulled out the last flare from his pack. Fingers trembling as he checked the trigger, but he did not fire it. Not yet. Not without visual, not without confirmation, she had said. 20 minutes, and 20 minutes had passed. Or maybe more, or maybe less time. No longer felt real here. The forest had bent it, broken. It turned it inside out. And then he heard it, a soft crunch like weight on dead leaves, followed by a shadow passing. Across his peripheral vision, not close, but near enough to freeze his body in place. He turned slowly, and saw nothing but trees and fog, and his own breath turning to smoke. He had seconds to decide stay and risk being caught or run, and risk being followed. So he chose a third option. He stood tall, stepped out from behind the log, and raised the flare high into the air. The sky erupted in red light, the sound hissing through the quiet like a scream that did not end, and the moment it rose, the forest changed. The trees seemed to pull back. The air thickened, and somewhere far off, he heard the unmistakable thrum of helicopter blades slicing through the atmosphere, getting closer. He exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours, but it was too soon to feel relief because a second sound echoed behind him, a whisper that turned into a footstep, and then another, and then the unmistakable sound of someone else breathing too close. He turned, fists raised, only to see Rena emerging from the tree-lined face, streaked with dirt, uniform torn at the shoulder, blood smeared along her temple, but her eyes were locked sharp and clear and focused. Extraction confirmed, she said. They will land in 3 minutes. Be ready for contact. The breach team has been intercepted. Alvarez stared at her, bleeding and bruised and still moving like she was born to survive anything, and he asked her how did you know where to find me? And she only gave a half smile and said, I never lost you behind her. 2 more figures stepped out of the mist, but they were not enemies. They were operatives in full black gear, helmets, visors, insignia, not of the cadet program, but of a higher order, a deeper level of command. And they nodded to Rena without speaking. Weapons raised, forming a perimeter as the sound of the helicopter grew louder. You are going to see something now, she said, and it might not make sense at first, but you deserve the truth. You kept your head when they didn't. You listened when others mocked. That's why you're still here. The chopper came in low blades, cutting the fog into ribbons, its lights blinding as it hovered just feet above the treetops, and then slowly descended the earth beneath them, swirling with wind and dirt and pine needles as the transport opened and more agents jumped out, moving in a sweep pattern surrounding the fallback point. One of them approached Rena and handed her a tablet. She swiped it quickly, scanning the contents before nodding. Breach team neutralized. Daniels recovered and sedated Hartman and 2 others awaiting debrief. The mission is concluded, she said, voice louder now for all to hear. The officer beside her said, confirm leadership shift. And she replied, affirmative. Initiate, reset. Command passes to Omega-level operations under my lead. All data will be transmitted to Central for full review, including internal misconduct reports and field failure. Logs. Alvarez barely understood what he was hearing, but he felt the impact in his bones. Rena was not just a cadet, not even just a covert observer. She was command high-level operational intelligence, and the entire barracks exercise had been her stage, her setup, her battlefield. She turned to him and said, "You thought I stayed silent because I was weak, because I was unsure, because I didn't know how to fight back. But the truth is, I stayed silent because I was watching. I was waiting. I was measuring who deserved to be where, who earned their place, who abused their power you passed," she said simply. He nodded slowly, still trying to process the moment, and then asked, "And then what happens to them? They get seen for who they really are," she said, "and for some that's reward, for others that's consequence." Hartman was one of those others. He had mocked her in the showers, taunted her during drills, led the squad with arrogance and insecurity, mistaking noise for leadership. But now he sat zip-tied in the second chopper, face pale, eyes wide, unable to look away as Rena approached and stood over him. "Do you know who I am now?" she asked, and he didn't answer. Couldn't answer. She leaned in close and said, "I'm the one they send when they need to know what people do when no one is watching, and you showed me everything I needed to see." She stood back and turned away, leaving him to sit in the silence of his own, making the laughter he once threw like knives now cutting only himself, as the agents secured the site and began their ascent. Rena and Alvarez boarded the primary chopper and lifted into the air, the forest shrinking below them, returning to its secrets. But something had changed now. Rena no longer wore the cadet uniform. It had been replaced with black gear marked with gold insignia, the mark of internal oversight, the kind few knew even existed. Alvarez sat across from her, still catching up, still turning over the past week in his mind, trying to understand how she had hidden so much behind so little. "You were never afraid," he said, and she looked at him for a long moment before replying, "I was always afraid. But fear is not weakness. It is a tool. It sharpens you if you let it break you. If you don't, and I couldn't afford to be broken. Not for what I came here to do." She looked out the window as the base came into view below, a hive of movement and machinery and stories no one else would ever know. And she wondered how many other Renas there were embedded, planted, silent, and waiting, watching for the cracks in the system. This mission was over, but the work never was. Below her, the barracks showers still stood empty now, echoes of laughter and judgment washed away by truth and consequence, and above them, the wind carried the sound of the rotors and something else. Something final. It was the sound of reckoning, and Rena knew they would never mock her again, not now, not ever.